Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. This is the place for senior school leaders to discover innovative ideas and actionable tips that are going to help to strengthen their school's income streams and secure its future. My name's Juliette Corbett, and I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in independent schools. So thanks for joining me today, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode where we're going to be talking to Bart Wielenga, head of Blundell School, all about bursaries and also strategy. So in last week's episode, I talked about crafting your bursary strategy. I used my 4 building blocks of strategy framework to talk through the key strategic choices that governors and heads really need to confront and make when they're crafting a robust bursary strategy. Whenever I use a framework like this, there's always a risk that it gets a little bit abstract. They're really useful frameworks, but sometimes it's useful to think about an example as well as thinking about it in theory. So this week, I wanted to bring us firmly into the real world, which is often a little bit more messy and complicated than a framework might suggest. So I'm delighted to be joined this week by Bart Wielenga. He's head of Blundell School in Tiverton in Devon here in the UK. Bart has been head of Blundell since 2018, and he was senior deputy head for 6 years prior to that as well. Blundell's was founded in 1604, and it's an HMC day and boarding school. It's got about 800 pupils in its senior school and over 200 in its prep school. So Bart and I have been working together in developing a robust strategy for Blundell's and also in looking at their fundraising. So I'm really delighted that he's joining me today to talk about both bursaries and strategy. Fantastic. So let's dive into my conversation with Bart. So hello, Bart, and thank you for joining us at the Independent School Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me here, Juliette. Real treat to be doing another show with you.
Yes, indeed. So Bart and I have done a number of webinars for different organisations, things like Agabus and so on, for governors in the past. And one of the things I talked about in last week's podcast episode was using the 4 building blocks of strategy framework that I often use with clients and I've talked about in this podcast before, and applying it to your bursary strategy and learning how you can use it to craft a really strategic plan for your bursaries. And in actual fact, Bart and I did a webinar about this with Agabus for governors here in the UK, for independent schools in the UK, a couple of months ago, and I think it'd be really exciting that we're talking about this again today. One of the things that I talked about in the podcast last week was about the first building block being the vision for why you want to expand or build your bursary program at your school. And I talked about 2 elements of that. The first was finding your bursary why, so why your school is really committed to bursaries. And I think there are 3 components to that often within schools. It's not just one why, there's often multiple reasons why schools are committed to bursaries. One of those is to do with social mobility, and it's a way that a school can implement its charitable or foundation purpose, kind of the reason it was established in the first place. The secondly is that bursaries really positively impact on the culture of the school in a whole variety of ways. And thirdly, it's the ways that bursaries can also, in addition to those 2 other elements, strengthen a school's business model as well. So Bart, I'd be really interested in your reflections as to what your why is at Blundell's when it comes to bursaries.
Yeah, thanks, Juliette. I think over the last little while, we've been spending quite a bit of time thinking about the why, not just for bursaries, but for the whole school and for a senior leadership team. And as we've expanded the conversation with members of Common Room, it has been what we care most about as a school. And in that process, there was a real exploration and a real desire to include what that meant for bursaries. And so a lot of our conversation on the bursaries has been, as a school, what do we want to achieve? And we recognized that in order to achieve the things we wanted to do, we needed to create greater access for pupils. And so it does align with the things that you said, certainly about what is the school for, what were our founders' intentions, and that's played a part in it. But the most fundamental thing is that we want to produce young men and women of consequence. And so our why is that we want to be a school that is a vehicle for young people to have the opportunity to develop themselves, to develop a social conscience, and then to go out into the world to make a difference. And we don't want to limit ourselves by only creating access for that process to pupils who have the financial resources to come here. We want to make that available to everyone. And so that's our fundamental why.
Yes, and I think as well it can really positively impact on the culture of the school as well. Have you felt that too?
Yeah, I think from that perspective, if we say that we want to be a school that develops young men and women of consequence who go out into the world with a passion and a desire to make the world a better place, then it's something that has to start within the school. And that means pupils coming from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, to learn to work together, to understand each other, to learn from each other, and to inspire each other, because that's the world they're going to be going into. And so the more we can do at school to create that openness, that inclusivity, the better the chances are of doing what we're setting out to achieve.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the conversations I frequently have with heads and governors and leaders when they're thinking about kind of expanding their bursary program, it is around that fact that they want their school to be as inclusive as possible and outward looking, not a kind of inward looking cloistered environment, but an outward looking school, and the culture kind of everything flows from that in terms of the way that they're encouraging people to their pupils, their staff, everybody in the school to interact with the society and the community around them. And bursary sits within that really firmly, that it is a way of expanding the school's ability to impact more widely on society. I think it's fascinating that so many of our independent schools, at least here in the UK, were set up, whether it's 50 years ago or hundreds of years ago, with the original purpose of expanding access to excellent education. Yeah, and certainly my passion for this comes from the fact that by fulfilling that original founding vision, it's a way that with independent schools as a sector can really play a positive role in society.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a restlessness in the sector to say, we have our independence. How do we make best possible use of that? And whilst all the traditional things that we do in educational institutions, like getting good exam results, really matter, and they continue to matter, I think we all, as teachers, as educators, we have a broader vision than just simply academic results. And a lot of that is about making a positive contribution to society. And at the moment, it feels like that restlessness is starting to feed into a greater inclusivity, a greater social purpose, a greater desire to do something that's important and that's inclusive. Yes. And that's where bursaries play an increasingly important part. I think that that it's often mistaken that there's sometimes a cynical perception that bursaries are simply a way of ticking a box. But I think it's far, far beyond that. And there's a real desire to do meaningful and important work.
Yes, absolutely. And that's certainly been mirrored by the conversations that I'm having day to day with heads, governors and leaders. Absolutely. It is really embedded in a desire to do excellent work within society and to open up that access rather than to tick a box. One of the things that I talked about as well last week in defining your school's vision for their bursary programme, I talked about 3 key strategic choices which every school will have to make as they're starting to craft their strategy. And I spoke at how there's no right or wrong answer to any of these, but each school needs to find the right balance that works for them. The first of those was the balance between offering transformational bursaries, so bursaries of maybe 100% or even 110% of the value of the fees, so that it really is opening up access to those who wouldn't be able to contribute anything towards their education in terms of their family finances, and balancing that with bursary offerings of a smaller reduction in fees. How have you approached that strategic choice at Blundell's?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it is a tension that you try to hold. I think some schools will specifically set out a strategy for one or the other. We haven't done that. I think the transformational one is exciting and can be tremendously rewarding, um, but it also comes with a health warning. I think there's responsibilities that come with that. And for us on that front, we seek opportunities for those transformational bursaries. Um, but actually, of course, we can include far more people by using lots of small bursaries. So we probably leaned towards the smaller bursaries, but when the right candidates come along, the transformational bursaries are the ones we get very excited about too. So it is about attention, and it's not one is right or the other. Some clearly suit a particular type of school better than others, but I think for us in our market here in the Southwest, being able to offer numerous smaller bursaries actually has a bigger impact perhaps than the one or two major transformational ones. But like I say, we're always looking for the right candidate to make that transformational bursary offer.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll come on in a moment to the sticking points, but the challenges with the scale of the financial side of transformational bursaries, as well as finding the right pupils who are going to really benefit from them, is a real challenge. The second strategic choice that I think schools need to make in that first vision stage of the strategy development is striking a balance between how much you're going to focus on endowment funding, so fundraising perhaps for an endowment, which will then produce an interest income which can be spent each year on bursaries, and how much you're going to focus on income generation through whatever means, perhaps fundraising, in order to spend the resources within a year or two, the kind of almost like a pay-as-you-go sort of bursary scheme. Have you struck a balance between those two? What's your decision on that for Blundell's?
Certainly strategically, we want to move towards the endowment. We have been very much hand to mouth up till now, but it's a matter of being patient. And I think the thing is that we want to be able to make that difference now. We want to bring those deserving pupils in now, but I think the right thing to do is to build an endowment over time for the long-term financial stability of the school, but also for a program that is sustainable and that will be more consistent. It can be more strategic if you've planned it for the long term rather than doing it hand to mouth. So our ambition is to build a strong endowment and to move away from the short term, slightly more myopic way we do things at the moment to a more sustainable endowment.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've talked before, and I mentioned in last week's episode, that the temptation is obviously the endowment. Everyone would go for that if they had the opportunity. But the challenge there is that each year you're making a relatively small impact in terms of how you can convey the impact on individual pupils and getting testimonials and comments and quotations from pupils, anonymous as needs be, about the impact that the fundraising or the income generation activities are having. Because the endowment is just that little bit slower to build over time than the more kind of spend now approach. I don't know how you've thought about overcoming that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think different schools obviously face different financial pressures and financial constraints. And many schools, their bursaries are simply a fee forfeiture. It's money that you don't get. And so it isn't actually paid for by anything. It's simply revenue that you just never receive. So from that perspective, it is about holding your nerve a little bit and saying, can we afford to delay drawing money down? Are we able to do that? Are we able to still bring in people but withhold money in that endowment so we allow it to grow over time? And is there an appetite in our wider community to contribute to an endowment? And again, I think my sense is that the wider community in independent schools are more inclined now to give towards endowments than perhaps they are to shiny new buildings. And so I think there's the appetite is probably there to start building endowments in a more meaningful way. Certainly, that's the way we are aiming to go.
Yes, absolutely. And then thirdly, the other kind of final strategic choice that I think schools need to make at this early kind of vision stage of their strategy is how they're going to communicate their own commitment of financial resources to the bursary programme. So whether that's a small amount of the fee income that's coming from current parents that's then allocated towards bursaries, whether that's the investment in a fundraising office and a really professionalised fundraising function to generate significant fundraising income. Whatever the route the school takes, there's going to be some form of financial commitment from the school. And the decision there is how to communicate that to communities that are part of your school community. What's been your thoughts on that side?
Yeah, I do think it requires some sensitivity to it, because parents need to be certain that the money that they're paying in fees is going to their child's education. And I think there will be a little bit of wariness that big scholarships or bursaries are going to middle-class families. And so I think it is important that we are responsible about managing expectations, that we're upfront and transparent about the programs that we are using. But at the same time, I also think that the vast majority of parents choose schools like ours because they believe that they are that we are forces for good in society, and so they don't want our schools to be exclusive. They actually want our schools to be places that are part of social transformation. And that is where it becomes important that as a leadership, we set out the vision for the whole school that the wider community buys into, so that they also understand why we want to push forward with the bursary program. But it does require careful thought, and it requires trust from your community. And so that isn't a one-off message. That's trust that's built over years and years of developing the narrative, of telling the story, of building relationships with the community, so that when we make decisions about how we use money, which might not be money for the now, but which might be money which will only bring a long-term dividend, that people understand why we're doing it and that they support that. But that's a long-term process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of these things, the way that you communicate that vision of the difference, the transformation that you're trying to bring, you need to make a case for support when you're fundraising, but you also need to make a case for support for your fee income, potentially, to then be slightly used somewhat to fund bursary programs and scholarships and so on. So I think it's all about communication and trust and understanding your own community, understanding what's different about your school community, what's unique, as to which approach is right and which messages are right, and how you're going to best build that trust.
I think it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because particularly at the moment, I think the emotional bond between schools and their communities have changed during the COVID period. I think schools that have managed it well have probably needed to be more transparent with the community, with parents, about the challenges that they are facing through the lockdown period. I think at the same time, schools have become far more central to the lives of families. We've been in people's front rooms and in their kitchens and in their lounges teaching online lessons. And so I think that at this time, the emotional bond between parents and the school is as strong as it's ever been. And we've been more interdependent than we've ever been. So it's a good time, too, to build on that relationship, to explain some of the challenges, and to develop that narrative. It's as good as an opportunity as we've had.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we were reflecting recently that it's almost like the voice of the school has changed during the pandemic, that the way you communicate, not just the messages, but the tone of voice and the language that you use has changed during the pandemic.
Yeah, it has. I think it's been a time where I used the word transparency earlier, but it has been exactly that. It's about building that trust, but the language has changed. It's rather than being more formal, it's been more informal. It's been more authentic. It's been very genuine and sincere. I think a lot of the the roles, the slightly formal roles of a public school being a little bit aloof from its market, it's that those things have dropped away. And I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work much more closely with parents, and we feel that we're pulling in the same direction, that parents really understand the efforts that the school is making in these challenging times. And at the same time, we have been far more empathetic to the hardships in many cases that families have faced, the strain families are under. Partly, I should imagine that parents are just realizing that looking after children is hard work, and trying to get them through their studies remotely hasn't been easy. So maybe we've got a bit more empathy from parents in that regard too. But
certainly, as a parent myself, you definitely have more empathy from that point of view. And it's interesting as well to reflect that I think during the pandemic, we've seen the acceleration of many trends. So things that were already happening slowly but surely, such as, independent schools having a slightly more informal voice, a slightly more relaxed approach to communicating with parents, in the sense of becoming one community, that everyone takes a role in educating these young people who are part of the school community, rather than the kind of aloofness as you alluded to. But that has certainly one of the many trends that's accelerated, I think, during this pandemic.
Yeah, and it's been a lovely thing too. I think for the first time in years, the press about independent schools hasn't been overtly negative or critical. I think that there's a feel-good factor amongst parents, or in the community, in schools like ours, that have said, you know what, during this time of real need, many schools have been able to step up and provide that structure and support, not just within the school environment, but actually to our communities and to the families at home. And that's been a big positive, perhaps, that we wouldn't have been able to achieve without these really, really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. So bringing us back a little to the 4 building blocks of strategy and the way that it can be used for bursaries. The second of those building blocks is looking at the accelerators and the sticking points. And in last week's episode, I talked about 2 of the main sticking points that people talk to me about most frequently. The first being how they'll find enough money to fund bursaries, and then the second being how they'll find the right applicants. I'd be interested to hear, Bart, on your reflections on what are the main sticking points that you're facing at Blundell's when it comes to bursaries, and how you're planning to overcome those.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, those 2 things are absolutely bang on for us as well. How we fund them and how we find the right applicants. I'm going to start with the second one in terms of finding the right applicants is hard, simply because so many people out there don't realize that those bursaries exist in the way that they need them to exist. In other words, people think, yes, we've heard that there's a bursary there, but it's not for people like us. And trying to convince people that we are accessible, that we are keen and open to embrace people from all kinds of backgrounds, and actually that they can come here and fit right in, that kids here are far more grounded perhaps than they realize. That is the real challenge. So it's overcoming some suspicion. And that is part of a much wider story of how we position ourselves in the market. And independent schools like ours, we've got to work hard to build trust with the community. We've spoken about building trust with our own parents, but it's also building trust with the wider population who perhaps don't know as much about us as a school, to say, we really, really want your kids to come here, to be part of this, to contribute, and also to receive from it. But that's a message that is much slower to get out there than one might imagine. And it requires quite a strategic approach of saying, how do we build links into the local community to make us feel less intimidating, to make us feel like we're a school that their children might flourish at. So that is the first one in terms of creating access. And so one of the strategies that we are using now is that our music department does lots of collaborations with local primary schools. We run art workshops for local primary schools and for schools in the area. So trying to open our doors more frequently to collaborate, to cooperative projects is a great way of actually showing people that we're normal people. And a place that they'd like to be part of. But it takes a bit of time.
Yes, and I think it's about understanding what the barriers are from the other point of view. So it's not just putting yourself in someone else's shoes and thinking about what the barriers are. It's actually asking and finding out and having conversations with people who can inform us, and so that we can learn what those barriers are, to people understanding the vocabulary we use within independent schools, or how overwhelming it may feel, not to be welcomed in a really authentic way at the front door as they arrive, things like that, which may not come up on our radar because we're quite used to that sort of environment. But it's only by having authentic conversations, two-way conversations with others in our community, our wider community, that we can understand as schools what are those barriers and how can we then overcome them, to be as open as possible in terms of appealing to as many people as possible in terms of the right applicants for bursaries.
Yeah, and it is about telling the story again, about stories that have been successful, of pupils who have come and who have thrived. I mean, for us, we've got a big road that runs through the middle of the school, and we've got our beautiful chapel right on the main road. And I think for many people, they look at the buildings and they find those imposing. So it can be even physical features like that can be a barrier to people considering applying for bursaries. And those are all the kind of things that we've got to be mindful of in finding the right candidates who might want to come here. But you're right, it is about understanding, and it's about empathy. It's about listening to people, and it takes a bit of time. It's not just simply throwing money at something. Far from it. It's almost the opposite. It's not got to do anything with money. It's got to do with building those good relationships. That doesn't cost anything other than time and commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. The one area that does take money, of course, is the actual provision and the funding of the bursaries themselves. What are you doing at Blundell's to fundraise for bursaries?
Yeah, I think we are using small gifts that contribute to bigger gifts. So it's a small donations at this point, and then of course the biggest contributor to our slowly developing endowment are legacy gifts. And so over the last 10 years or so, we have spent a lot of time building up our legacy program, and that is starting to have a real impact. And that's something we're very proud of, and it's something that we share with our old Blundellian community, and it's something we hope to continue to build on. I mentioned earlier that I do think that the appetite now is not for parents or past pupils to pay for shiny new buildings. There's a far greater appetite to create access, especially at the moment where it feels again that independent schools are offering something very, very worthwhile. And during these difficult times, I've had more old Blundellians come to me to say they'd like to give to a program, even before we've asked, because they've recognized that during a time of turmoil and uncertainty, what we've been as a school is a safe, secure, forward-thinking environment, one that they're very proud of and which therefore they want to support. So whilst it's been our endowment that's slowly developing, has been built on the back of legacy gifts, we anticipate that in the next little while we're going to be building on it far more quickly by relationship building with bigger donors. And so that's our strategy at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is this sense of the importance of connecting a case for support in a fundraising sense to the current pandemic that we're going through. And I've spoken before on this podcast about the ease of connection for the bursary message through to that negative impact on social mobility, and the income differential that we're seeing kind of expand, ever wider gap in our society in terms of the haves and have-nots. I think that it is easier to connect a bursary case for support through to how we can help society to recover from the pandemic. And so people are feeling motivated and inspired to give to organisations that they trust, that they're proud of, in order to contribute to that recovery over time. One of the things, so I spoke a little bit in the last week's episode about the third and fourth stages of the 4 building blocks of strategy, being the general approach and the action plan. You can listen to last week's episode for a little bit more information about that. But Bart, you and I have worked together on strategy for Blundell's using these sort of 4 building blocks of strategy framework. I'd be really interested to hear your feedback on how that helped to clarify your thinking as a senior leadership team.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier that for us, the fundamental piece of work was going back to saying, what are we trying to achieve? What is this for? What is it that we care most about? And what are we most passionate about? And we all concluded very quickly it wasn't about brilliant exam results. It wasn't about number of pupils getting to Oxford and Cambridge. It wasn't about how many rugby matches we win. All those things are important. They all matter, and they're all wonderfully rewarding for us as quite tangible rewards for what we do. But there's a far bigger purpose to what we want to achieve, and that is to genuinely make a difference to society, to produce young men and women of consequence. And once we've sorted that out, what it is that we really wanting to achieve, then we can start to work backwards from that. So that first step of trying to develop a vision, one that we felt suited the school, fitted in with the history of the school and the character of the school, that was a starting point. And without that, I think we were always going to muddle through. And so that was a really important part. And then trying to work out what are the things, the obstacles, the sticking points, as you've called them, what are the things we need to find some solutions to, or if we couldn't solve them, at least what do we need to be aware of? And then finally seeing what are the accelerators, what are the things that we can piggyback on that are already going really well that we're needing to accelerate towards our goals. So that those first 2 things in particular were helpful. They took quite a long time, took a lot of going backwards and forwards, but I think once we settled on that, we all felt much more comfortable and confident with what we needed to do next.
Yes, I often find that so good strategy is always simple. The outcome, you need to be able to communicate to your internal audience and your external audience. It needs to be really clear and really simple. But the process to get there often involves a really deep reflection for individuals and teams and whole organisations, whole schools, to reflect on their vision and what their purpose is, their kind of why. Yeah. And so once the time and effort has gone into identifying that vision and the things that are going really well, so the accelerators, and the things that are holding you back and the sticking points, once that work is done, the rest of it can be quite quick and easy, and often it can seem really obvious when you look back at it, but that's only because you've arrived at something with simplicity and clarity, because you've done some of that deep reflection work and analysis and teamwork to identify what those are in your unique school environment and culture.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think once we got to that point, we then spent a bit of time unpacking. So how do we want to do that? And that's where the policy and the action plan came in. And I think for us, it became quite quickly, we decided that we wanted to focus on getting processes in the school right. And that was both in terms of academic processes as well as pastoral processes. And so we made a commitment as part of going through the 4 stages. We made a commitment to focus on process rather than outcomes. That outcomes were ones that we couldn't necessarily control, but the processes, the internal process, we could control. So we're going to focus on that. The outcomes gave us the feedback that told us whether our processes were working. And I think once we'd committed to that system, what we were going to pay attention to, that again, that accelerated the process, that helped us to free up our thinking. And that's been very successful for us.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. A couple of years ago, I produced a research report called Rethinking Strategy in Independent Schools. And for that research, I interviewed a whole variety of heads and senior leaders in independent schools, and completely confidentially, almost all of them shared with me the point of view that strategic thinking wasn't something that most schools really gave much thought to, and that they didn't necessarily feel that leaders, as they're prepared for stepping up in terms of leadership positions, weren't necessarily trained in strategic thinking skills. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on strategic thinking, and whether or not it's becoming more important in schools, partly because of the competitive marketplace in which we're operating now, but also due to the pandemic and the swift change that's brought in our environment.
Yeah, look, I think there is an element of saying some people are more predisposed to an operational mindset, and others are more predisposed towards a strategic mindset. But there's no question that strategy is fundamentally important. I think for us, as schools like ours are quite complex beasts. And the one thing that I'll keep going back to is this idea of coherence, the idea that the different parts do need to fit together. They need to pull in the same direction. And it's very easy for institutions like ours to be slightly contradictory, that the things that we believe and the things that we are doing might not be aligned. And I think that's where strategic vision really, really matters, for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of all pulling in the same direction. But there's also another part to that, and that's strategy. If we get the strategy right, we're likely to be more coherent. But coherence is also a reflection of the integrity of the school. Because if we're coherent, it means that what we believe about education, what we believe a school should be doing, is aligned with what we're actually doing. And interrogating all the different elements of a school to ensure that they are aligned ensures the integrity of what we're doing. And that, of course, feeds back into the message, and that lends to the transparency of what we're trying to do as a school within the community, within our parent body, and it builds that narrative and develops trust. So strategy isn't only important for the internal processes, but actually it's also really important for what it communicates to the people outside of the immediate school environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that element of coherence of decision making is so critically important to strategy. And maybe it's slightly outdated now, maybe it still happens, but the idea that you can create a strategic plan, send it to everybody, and that's it, that's strategy done, completely fails to acknowledge that it needs to be something that's lived by every member of the small school community. And it's decisions that are being made each day, kind of day to day on the ground, that need to be a whole coherence, a consistency with the strategy and the general kind of way that the school is going in terms of its direction. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, because that's what parents see, that's what pupils see, that's what potential, prospective parents see. And so it is that coherence of decision making, and the fact that you've linked that through to the integrity of the school is really fascinating and really important. And it comes back again to that kind of why your school exists, why it was founded, but now what its current purpose is, which obviously echoes back to our conversation about bursaries, but also to the importance of strategy not being a buzzword, but being something that everyone can live on a day-to-day basis, because it is an articulation of the essence of your school.
And I think that's been highlighted through this COVID period, because schools that had their strategy worked out, decision making that was aligned with the strategy was much easier to do than having to make isolated decisions, because we've had to make a lot of decisions, often in the half light, without knowing all the facts, without knowing what's going to come next. And being guided by some very fundamental strategic principles has at least given us a chance. We're not just chucking darts in the dark. And it has given us a line of sight of what we're trying to achieve. And as long as we've tried to be consistent and loyal to that, it's certainly given us a North Star, if you like, during these times.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, just to wrap up, that is the essential part of strategy is creating that North Star, as you put it, that all of the decisions can align to. And in times of rapid change, that is so important to understand the general direction you're heading in, because otherwise, if everyone's just working to a particular policy or a particular procedure and loses sight of the big vision and the why and the direction, when everything changes around us, it could be difficult to change those things on the dime, as we have often had to do in the last few months. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bart. It's been really fascinating to talk to you both about bursaries and about more general strategy within independent schools. Thank you so much for sharing with us your experience at Blundell's and your plans going forwards. And I think the thing that really is underlined for me by this conversation is this idea of the restlessness and the momentum that is building within the independent school sector, and the desire that they have to make a positive contribution to society, both through bursaries and, of course, partnership programs as well. So thank you for spending some time with us, talking to us today, Bart.
That's an absolute pleasure, Juliet. And I'm so mindful that I'm only scratching the surface of these topics. There's still a lot that we have to learn, but it's always fun to be able to talk about it, to explore the different avenues. So thank you for letting me be part of that.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time.
All right. Bye-bye.
So that's it for today, and thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast. If you want to make sure that you don't miss out on future episodes, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. There you can also explore the various ways that I help independent schools to strengthen their income streams and secure their future. Fantastic. See you next time then.